Microphone's situated correctly. I didn't realize with a sweater there's nowhere to pin the thing, so it's way up here. So we'll see how this works. Maybe there won't be any feedback or anything. Well, we had a couple of weeks there where the snow kept us locked out, but here we are back, so it's good to be back in person. I asked Ralph where we got to, and he said right here, and I do think we got a little farther than this. I remember talking about this now that I pulled it up and looked at it. So we may cover a little, overlap a little bit from Ralph's last lesson and mine, but it'll be okay. I remember we talked a little bit about, was it Paul that had this vision or was it somebody else? So maybe you, anyway, we're going to go through it. Revelations 1, no, not Revelations there, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 1. It is not expedient for me, doubtless to glory, I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. How that he was caught up into a paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. Well, as we talked about last time, the general consensus is Paul's talking about himself, that he was the one that maybe when he was in Arabia for those years after his conversion, that he had an experience where he was called into heaven and saw these glorious things, but he's humble enough, he doesn't want to brag about it. And he says, if I'm going to brag about anything, I'll brag about my infirmities, the things that I've been through. So, Paul's facing some opposition in Corinthians. We remember that there's these super or preeminent apostles that have come around, and they've found a way to make money off the spreading of the gospel, and they're trying to discredit their competition. They're trying to discredit Paul, and Paul's in a position here where he's having to defend himself to a church that he helped establish. So he said it's silly to keep boasting, let's move on to visions and revelations from the Lord. He said, and he knows one who had a similar experience to John in Revelations. So, and this is probably Paul himself. We know that in Revelations, John was kind of called up in the Spirit when he was on Patmos, and he had visions that was recorded as the book of Revelations. In Revelations 1:10 it says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. Down in verse 11 saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. In verse 12, and I turned to see the Lord, the voice of that spake with me. In verse 13, one likened to the Son of Man. Ezekiel also in 8:3 said, and he put forth the form of a hand and took me by a lock of mine head. And the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. In visions of God to Jerusalem. So he was taken to Jerusalem in a vision. To the door of the inner gate, and looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. So it's not unheard of that people are called up in the Spirit, from a biblical sense, and see great revelations. And Paul, apparently, if he's referring to himself, had this experience. The third heaven he responds to, this is the only time that particular phrase is used in the Bible as far as I could tell. What exactly it means, I don't know. I heard a preacher talk about it one time, and they said the first heavens may be the atmosphere, and the second heaven is space, and the third heaven is the heavenly realm. And he's just saying, I was called up into the heavenly realm. And that's as good an explanation for it as what I could give you. So if you have a better insight into what the third heaven is, you know more than I do. But we'll go with that. He was saying he got called up into the heavenly realm and saw the things of heaven. One commentary described the first heaven as our atmosphere, the second heaven as outer space, and the third heaven as the spiritual realm. So, in any event, it isn't helpful to overly speculate on such things. I try to be practical and understand. There's just some things in the Bible I'm not going to fully understand. That's okay. We'll just have faith and take it for what it says and just move on, and we don't have to know everything. You know, I can't grasp the ideals of infinity or time having a beginning or an end, or did it or not, or does it, space, was there ever a time when there wasn't space? If so, what was there? Where was, those things boggle my mind. Certainly there's some creature somewhere that has knowledge and wisdom that far surpasses anything I can grasp, and that stuff to him is understandable. To me, it's always going to be beyond my grasp. So, except I'm not going to understand it all, and just move on. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knows. So did this experience happen to him actually? Or was it more of a vision when he was carried in a vision somewhere? Was it more of a dream state, or was he actually taken into heaven? And he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words which is not lawful for a man to utter. So he was in the presence of God, overhearing, or at least in the spiritual realm, overhearing things that, it's not necessarily meant for men to hear, but he was allowed to hear that. You remember back in the time of Moses, before they had the tabernacle, Moses would go out to his tent on the outskirts of the camp, and the Spirit of God would settle down in front of the tent, and God would speak with Moses face to face. Not face to face, but it says face. But the image of God, in some sense, communicated directly with Moses. And later, when the tabernacle was built, the Spirit of God in the form of the pillar of fire or smoke would settle on the temple, and the glory would fill it, and Moses would speak to God. And so, but God didn't speak to everyone. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai to hear the Ten Commandments, everybody else stayed away from the mountain. If they touched the mountain, they'd die. It's a scary and terrible and magnificent thing to stand in the presence of God and hear godly things. And so, and when he's talking about unspeakable things, that's what he's talking about. It's these overwhelming things that are godly, things that you would think about as the book of Revelations and Moses' experience on the mountain and things like that. Of such a one I will glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in my infirmity. So he's saying, if we're going to brag about something, let's brag about somebody like this. Whether he's talking about himself or somebody else, I'm not entirely sure, but he's saying, someone that's like Apostle John, who had the experience of Revelations, or Moses, or this person who was in the presence of God. You all are bragging about a lot of stuff. But what about somebody like this? This is the kind of thing we should brag about. For though I would desire to go to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. So it's not necessarily foolish for him to brag, he's saying, because it would be the truth. He's saying, I could tell you about everything I've done, but I don't want to come all across as being prideful. But if he did brag about it, it would at least be the truth, because Paul went through a lot. But the focus wasn't supposed to be on Paul. Paul understood the focus is supposed to be on God. So we know in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus was criticizing, he was saying things like, well, don't say your prayers on the street corners to be seen of men. If you're doing it for your personal glory, you've got all the glory you're ever going to get. Don't do your alms in front of crowds to be seen of the crowds. Because if you're doing it for the glory of the crowds, God's not going to honor that. Because your heart's in the wrong place. It's not to honor God, it's to honor yourself. Same thing with fasting, Don't go out to be... Again, in those examples, I don't think he was condemning public prayer or public benevolence. He was saying that what he was condemning was having your heart in the wrong place. And if you're doing it for the glory of yourself, you've missed the point. But Paul understood. Listen, let's don't make this about me. Let's keep the focus on God. Let's keep the focus on Jesus. Let's keep the focus on the Word, the plan of salvation. Let's not make it about man. Let's make it about God. Some of the Corinthians were already putting the focus on men. Because don't you remember early in Corinthians, they were arguing, well, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter, I'm of Paul. They were already making it less about God, more about, well, who was the teacher? So Paul maybe, when he makes these comments, kind of throwing back to that earlier reference where they were stumbling with putting their faith in men instead of their faith in God. Anyway, I've been talking here and not paused to ask if anyone has a comment or a question. Let me do that. Anybody? All right, the next section is weakness for Christ's sake. We'll jump into that. And lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities than that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For now I'm weak, then I am strong. And I don't remember if do you know, Ralph, did we get to this part last time? Did you kind of can't remember exactly?
Yeah, I had backed up when I gave you the starting point. I backed up for a few verses of review, I guess, just reading that.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. I mean, I'm not complaining. I just don't know where we were. So Paul is saying here, I'm extrapolating maybe what his thoughts were. He grew up in a position of some importance, I guess. He was a Pharisee. He studied under Gamaliel, or however you say that name. And he had a lot of zeal in the church. And he rose in the ranks, and he was given letters from the courts to go and arrest Christians. He was an up-and-coming fellow there in the religious establishment of the day. So he had some things that he could have exalted himself, that he was well studied and that he had studied under great teachers and that he had been, very enthusiastic. Then when he converted to Christianity, his enthusiasm shifted, but he continued to be very enthusiastic and put forth a lot of effort. And he could have bragged about those things. So he says, lest I should be exalted above all measure, he said, so my comment there says, so others wouldn't think too highly of him, and he of himself, God gave him a thorn in the flesh. So he's thinking about, it's important to stay humble. It's important to keep the focus on God. And maybe some of these super or preeminent apostles that he refers to several times, that was questioning him had, put the focus in the wrong place, that put the focus on the money they were making and not on God. They had turned it into a business, and it wasn't their business to be profitable. It wasn't as much about spreading the gospel as it was generating a revenue. And, it's just another way of him saying, quit elevating yourselves. Quit elevating human causes. Let's keep the focus where it ought to be, not on ourselves, not on making money, not on elevating ourselves in the eyes of men, whatever the reason. Let's keep the focus in the right place. But he's then saying, you know what? God gave me something to make sure I didn't elevate myself too much. He gave me a thorn in the flesh. So again, he doesn't brag because he doesn't want the focus to be on him. The thorn in the flesh. And we talked a little about what was this thorn that he was given. And you remember on the road to Damascus, he was blinded for a while, and he went, and it was Ananias, wasn't it, that came and preached to him? And the scales fell off his eyes, and he could see again. Well, sometimes when he wrote letters, he would have a someone to scribe the letters for him, but he would sign them in his own hand. And in one of the letters, he references, look how big I've signed this, my signature is. So people speculate because of those things, maybe his thorn in the flesh was his eyesight. I don't know. There's other places where Paul is criticized for not being an eloquent speaker. That's not exactly a thorn in the flesh, but maybe from a certain point of view it is. I don't know what the thorn in the flesh is. I don't guess anyone does, but I'm giving you a couple of ideas that people float around. Could it be in context his speaking ability? He's been talking about that in this letter, that people accuse him of being timid when he's in person, but bold when he's writing letters from a distance. Could that be it? Could it be his eyesight? I don't know. For this thing, he said, I besought the Lord thrice that it might depart from me. So 3 times he went to the Lord and he said, Lord, whatever this is, I don't much like it. It seems to be getting in my way. Things would be a lot better if I didn't have this problem. Or why don't you just take that away from me? Once he went to God and no, didn't get what he asked for. The second time he went to God, didn't get what he asked for. The third time he went to God, he didn't get what he asked for. 3 times. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ might rest upon me. So this particular verse over the year has been one that I've spent a considerable amount of time pondering. Because, in my profession over the years, as I've counseled people, I see people lots of times when they're in their most weak place. And it makes me wonder about, well, what's God really mean by this? Because there's probably something in there that could be useful for me. And I remember when I read the Bible just how many times God used weak people to accomplish. I mean, when David was a shepherd boy, he had to face Goliath. There was, how many times did God pick the second son instead of the first son to be the one through whom the blessings would flow? What about Gideon? He was gathered him up an army, and God said, no, you got too many people. Keep going. Let's whittle them down. Let's whittle them down. And, how many times did God show his strength through someone's weakness? And I wonder, what's the meaning of that? And I'm going to tell you what my understanding of it is today. And it may not be correct, but it's where my mind lands on it. If God looked down at Paul and thought, man, this guy, he's going to be the one that's going to go out and go travel around on these 3 missionary journeys, and he's going to spread my word and get these early Christians, Gentiles, these early churches started. And along the way, he's going to be beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and hungry and cold and all the things that we know that Paul went through. God probably looked down and thought, you know what? If you think that you're going to do this and just rely on yourself, you're going to fail. That you need to learn the lesson that you're going to have to depend on me, because you can't do it on your own. And maybe that's the lesson in this, that when we face the hard times and we're weak, that we have to rely on God, because we can't always do it by ourselves. I'm not saying we shouldn't if we can, but there's times when, you're going to have to be strong because God is working through you, not because you can do it on your own. So people in the world that are going through troubles and don't have God, that's a tough spot. At least when we're going through troubles, we've at least got our faith in God. Our faith that there's something better after this world is over, that there's a salvation that awaits for us, and that hope and that peace that Raymond was talking about today, the peace. I don't know how you get that peace in the difficult times if it's not through this kind of knowledge. Anyway, I'm belaboring this verse. Anybody have any other thoughts about this?
Infirmities would no doubt keep you humble.
They will. They will. Do you think Paul on his own could have done everything that he did if God hadn't been with him, strengthening him? Even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed, God, if it's possible, let this pass from me. And even the angels come and ministered to him, that he needed strengthening to go through with his Father's plan. And, it's sometimes we just got to have God. Any other thoughts?
It says to glory in your infirmities.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Glory in your infirmities. Celebrate them. I don't know. That's a tough one. That's kind of like, I used to read and hear lessons about on the Sermon on the Mount. It'd be going so good, and then Jesus would say, love your enemy. Man, that's a tough one. I mean, and turn the other cheek. Oh my, wow, that's a big one. Go the extra mile. This ain't working out here. What's going on? And I realized finally he was making a point that, it's easy to love people that's good to you. It's easy to give the minimum. What's hard is that's just human nature, what we're talking about. His kind of love that he was preaching was something that's beyond human nature, something you have to choose to do. It's not going to come natural to you to love your enemy. You're going to have to choose that. And that's hard. And that was the point. Of course, Jesus wasn't a hypocrite. He turned the other cheek. He died on the cross. He prayed for the people that was crucifying him. I mean, he wasn't a hypocrite. He lived it. But he wanted us to live it too. And he didn't just teach it, he gave the example. Maybe this about glorying in your infirmities somehow is along that vein that, it don't seem right. That requires some sort of choice. That's hard. But that's the difference between looking at it from a human perspective and a spiritual perspective. From a spiritual perspective, you can glorify in your infirmities because that would demonstrate your reliance on God. Tough one, right? No one wants to hear that. No one wants to go through that. I don't want to go through it. I guess you got to choose it. So Paul's weakness keeps the focus on the message. It's interesting that one of the things as you read the New Testament, when Jesus is going in all the cities and the people find out that he's healing people, they keep coming and bringing the people that are weak and sick to him because they're wanting that physical healing. And I'm sure if there was a healer around and our child had a disease that they were going to die, we would go to the healer too and lower him through the roof if we could to get that healing. So I'm not being critical, but Jesus' point, the reason why he came was to spread the gospel. And the miracles was to confirm the gospel. But the thing that was confirming the gospel ended up being more important to the people than the gospel itself. And, I feel like that's probably why he was saying, don't go tell everybody. Give me a chance here to have a few days to preach before I get swamped with people that's wanting physical healing. Give me a chance here to work on some spiritual healing. And again, I don't know if I understand that correctly either. Those are difficult verses too. But sometimes in your weakness, that's where the strength happens. Okay, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For I am weak, then I am strong. So when you're going through all of that, and you can maintain your faith in Christ, your body may be weak, but your spirit and your faith is strong. I think that's what he's saying. Now, there's time your body and stuff's going to fail you, and your emotions and all of that is going to fail you. Sometimes the only thing you've got for strength is your faith. And that's what's left. And again, if you don't have Christ and if you don't have God, I think most of us have probably been through a time in our life at some point when it felt like there's nothing to hold on to right now, except the one thing you know is not going away. God, that if you don't have that last thread to hang on to when life gets hard, and it's not going away, that's one that's going to be there. I don't know how people get through some of the things that people go through without having that. So he's strong despite the thorn. Again, I think he's talking about through his faith in Christ, his faith is strong. He's spiritually strong, even though he might be physically weak. Anybody have a different perspective of that? We're getting close to 5 till. We'll see if we can get through this little section here, and then we'll pause. So despite the thorn that he was given, he was still out doing God's work. God had a plan for him. No matter what obstacles he had, this physical thorn, as he calls it, or all the persecutions he faced, he kept going. So, I think God gives us the talents and the skills and the resources to do whatever it is that he has in mind for us to do, if we will just do it and be good stewards of the talents and the resources that he's given us. I think we have what we need to accomplish his purpose for us. I don't know that we always use it. Sometimes we get the focus on ourselves and, hey, let me use my talent resources for me instead of let me use that for God. Okay, that takes us to the next little section. We'll stop there. That's 5 till. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? We'll ring the bell. If you can, just stick around for a second. A couple things I want to mention to you all. I'll be right back.